The Sound Beneath the Floor. October 1883, Northern Louisiana. A traveling preacher named Samuel Carta arrived in a quiet farming parish surrounded by endless cotton fields and muddy country roads. The town looked peaceful, too peaceful. Families lived miles apart, no one asked too many questions, and strangers rarely stayed long. But Carta decided to visit one family the locals spoke highly of, the Mercers, a respectable household, a hard-working father, a quiet mother, 3 well-behaved children. At least that's what everyone believed. The preacher sat at the Mercer dining table while Mr. Mercer spoke about crops and weather, and that's when Carter heard it, a sound not outside, not in the walls, beneath the floor, 3 slow knocks, tap, 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 then silence, then 3 more. The preacher froze. It wasn't the random scratching of an animal, it sounded intentional, like someone sending a signal. Carter looked down at the wooden boards beneath his boots. The knocking came again, 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, careful, measured almost like a code. He asked Mr. Mercer what it was. The farmer smiled, said the house was old, said animals sometimes crawled under the foundation. But Carta noticed something strange. Mrs. Mercer wasn't smiling, she was staring at the floor, and her hands were shaking. That night, the preacher wrote a single line in his journal: there is something alive beneath that house. 3 weeks later, authorities would dig beneath the Mercer home. What they discovered under the floorboards would horrify the entire state of Louisiana, because the Mercer family wasn't hiding a secret. They were hiding someone. Someone who had been locked underground for years, the house no one entered. In the year 1883, deep in the humid countryside of northern Louisiana, there stood a farmhouse that most people in the area knew well, but almost no one had ever seen the inside of. It belonged to a man named Jonathan Mercer. From the road the property looked ordinary. A wooden farmhouse with peeling white paint, a narrow porch facing the fields, cotton rows stretching out behind the barn, and tall oak trees that cast long shadows across the yard every evening. At first glance, the Mercer farm looked like hundreds of others scattered across the Louisiana countryside. But the longer someone lived in that area, the more unusual the Mercer family began to seem. Jonathan Mercer was not an unfriendly man. In fact, neighbors often described him as polite, quiet, even respectful. He attended church most Sundays, he traded livestock with nearby farmers, and when travelers passed through the parish, Mercer was known to offer directions or water from the well. Yet despite these interactions, no one in town had ever truly stepped inside the Mercer house. Visitors were always greeted on the porch. Conversations always happened outdoors. Jonathan Mercer always had a reason. The house was messy. His wife was ill, the children were sleeping. In a rural community where privacy was respected, people accepted these explanations. At least at first. But over time, small details began to create quiet unease among the neighbors, because the Mercer children were rarely seen. Everyone in the parish knew the family had 3 children, 2 boys and a daughter, but the truth was very few people had ever actually seen them. Occasionally, the oldest boy, Daniel Mercer, could be spotted walking beside his father in the cotton fields. He looked thin and strangely quiet for a child his age. He rarely spoke to other children, and when they tried to talk to him, Daniel often looked confused, as if he had forgotten how conversations worked. But the other 2 children were even more mysterious. The younger boy, Thomas, and the girl, Sarah, were almost never seen outside the Mercer house. When neighbors asked about them, Jonathan Mercer always answered calmly, "They are sick. They stay indoors. They help their mother." In a place where families kept to themselves, no one pressed the issue. But something else about the Mercer house slowly began to trouble the town. The sounds. At night, strange sounds sometimes came from the property. Farmers working late in their fields occasionally reported hearing noises drifting across the quiet countryside. Not voices, not animals, something else. A dull knocking, slow, rhythmic, almost deliberate. At first, people assumed the sounds came from livestock, or loose boards beneath the house shifting in the wind. But the pattern began to disturb those who noticed it. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more knocks. Then, silence. The sounds didn't happen every night. Sometimes weeks would pass with nothing unusual. But when the knocking returned, it always followed the same pattern. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. No one could explain it, and eventually people simply stopped mentioning it. Because in isolated communities like this, uncomfortable questions were often ignored. But there was one person who noticed something else. A woman named Clara Jenkins. Clara lived on a small farm less than half a mile from the Mercer property. Her kitchen window faced the road that ran past the Mercer house. From that window she could see the Mercer yard clearly, and over the years Clara began noticing something deeply unsettling. Jonathan Mercer spent a great deal of time digging beneath his house. At first she assumed he was repairing the foundation. or reinforcing the supports, but the digging continued for weeks, then months, and the soil beneath the house kept changing. Fresh earth, moved earth. Sometimes small piles of dirt appeared behind the barn, sometimes near the tree line. Clara mentioned this to her husband one evening. He shrugged. Farmers often dug storage pits beneath houses or cellars for food. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something about the Mercer property wasn't right. Then one night something happened that she would remember for the rest of her life. It was late autumn. The air was cool, and the countryside was silent except for the distant hum of insects. Clara had woken in the middle of the night. She walked to the kitchen window to get a drink of water, and that's when she saw the lantern, a faint light moving across the Mercer yard. Jonathan Mercer was outside digging. In the middle of the night he worked slowly, carefully, his lantern casting long shadows across the ground. Clara watched for several minutes. Then something even stranger happened. Mercer stopped digging. He walked toward the house, and he opened a small wooden door built into the foundation. A door Clara had never noticed before. It was low, barely large enough for a person to crawl through. Mercer knelt beside it, and for several seconds he spoke quietly into the darkness beneath the house. Clara could not hear the words, but she saw something that chilled her completely. Mercer placed a small metal bowl through the opening. Then he closed the door again, locked it, and walked back toward the house. Clara stood frozen at the window, her mind racing. She told herself there must be a reasonable explanation, a storage cellar, animals, tools. But one question refused to leave her thoughts. Why would someone bring food to a locked door beneath their house in the middle of the night? For several weeks she kept the observation to herself, but the unease in the town slowly grew stronger. Because by the winter of 1883, even the Mercer family themselves seemed to be changing. Jonathan Mercer began avoiding church. Daniel Mercer stopped appearing in the fields, and the strange knocking beneath the house began happening more frequently. 3 knocks, pores, 3 knocks. Some neighbors said it was nothing. Old houses made strange noises, but others were no longer so sure, because something about the Mercer property felt wrong, deeply wrong. And the truth was, no one in the parish had yet realized something terrifying. The knocking beneath the house was not the sound of wood, or animals, or shifting soil. It was the sound of someone trying to get out. And in the coming weeks, when authorities finally opened the ground beneath the Mercer home, they would discover a hidden room, a room no one in the town knew existed, a room that had been locked from the outside, and inside that room they would find 3 children. Children who had been living in darkness for years. The night the preacher heard the knocking. In the autumn of 1883, a traveling preacher arrived in the small parish outside Monroe, Louisiana. His name was Samuel Carta. Carta had spent years traveling through the southern countryside, visiting isolated farms and small communities, where churches were rare and ministers even rarer. He carried little with him: a Bible, a worn leather journal, and a small bag of clothes tied behind the saddle of his horse. For Carta, the journey from town to town was routine. Most evenings were the same: a simple meal with a local family, a prayer, a quiet sermon spoken to a handful of people gathered in someone's living room. But the night he arrived at the Mercer farm would stay with him for the rest of his life. The sun had already begun to sink behind the cypress trees when Carta first saw the house. The Mercer property sat alone at the end of a narrow dirt road. Cotton fields surrounded it on all sides. Beyond the fields stood a dense wall of forest. Carta approached slowly, his horse's hooves crunching softly over dry soil. Jonathan Mercer stepped out onto the porch as the preacher approached. The farmer greeted him politely, as he always greeted strangers, but Carta immediately noticed something unusual. Mercer seemed tense, not frightened, not hostile, just alert, as if he had been expecting someone to arrive. Carta introduced himself and explained his purpose. Mercer hesitated for only a moment before inviting him to stay for supper. The preacher tied his horse near the well and stepped onto the porch. Inside the house, the air felt heavy. The interior was dimly lit by a single oil lantern hanging above the dining table. The wooden walls were bare. The room was almost unnaturally quiet. Abigail Mercer sat at the table preparing plates. She looked up briefly when Carta entered. Her expression was calm, but her eyes held something else. Fear. Not the fear of strangers, the fear of something already present, something already known. The 3 adults sat together at the table. Dinner was simple: cornbread, beans, salted pork. Conversation was polite but restrained. Carta asked about the farm, about the harvest, about the town nearby. Jonathan Mercer answered calmly, but something about the man felt distant, as if part of his attention remained focused somewhere else, somewhere inside the house. Halfway through the meal, Carta heard it, a sound soft, barely noticeable. At first he thought it might be the wind, but the night outside was completely still. Then the sound came again, tap, 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 3 knocks. Carta paused. The sound had come from beneath the floor. He waited. Perhaps no one else had heard it. But then Abigail Mercer's hand suddenly froze above the table. The spoon she was holding trembled slightly. Jonathan Mercer continued eating, completely calm, as if nothing had happened. Then the sound came again, tap, 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 3 more knocks. Carta slowly looked down at the wooden floorboards beneath his boots. The sound was unmistakable now. It had come from directly below them. The preacher cleared his throat. Is there something beneath the house? Jonathan Mercer wiped his mouth with a cloth. Animals, he said casually. Possums sometimes crawl under there. Carta nodded slowly, but something about the explanation felt wrong. The knocks had not sounded random. They had sounded intentional. The meal continued. But the atmosphere inside the room had changed. Carta could feel it. Abigail Mercer barely touched her food. Her eyes kept drifting toward the floor. Jonathan Mercer spoke less and less, and every few minutes the knocking returned. Always the same pattern. 3 taps. Pause, 3 taps. Eventually Carta could ignore it no longer. He leaned slightly closer to Mercer. That doesn't sound like an animal. Mercer's expression remained calm, but his eyes hardened slightly. The woods make strange sounds at night. The preacher decided not to push further, but the unease inside him continued growing. After dinner Mercer offered Carta a place to sleep, a small spare room near the back of the house. Carta thanked him and retired early. But sleep would not come easily. The night air outside was thick and silent. No wind moved through the trees. No insects hummed in the darkness. And sometime after midnight the knocking began again. Louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Carta sat up in bed. His heart began beating faster. The sound was not coming from the dining room now. It was coming from directly beneath his bedroom. Slowly he stood. He lit a small candle beside the bed. The knocks came again. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. Carta stepped carefully into the hallway. The house was dark. Only faint moonlight leaked through the windows, and then he heard something else. A whisper, not words. Just a faint sound like someone breathing beneath the floor. Carta's candle trembled in his hand. He knelt slowly and placed his ear against the wooden boards. The knocking stopped. For several seconds there was only silence. Then something happened that froze the preacher completely. A small voice whispered from beneath the floor. So faint it was almost impossible to hear. Help! Carta stumbled backward. His mind raced. Had he imagined it? Had the sound come from outside? But then the knocking returned. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. Not random, not animal, a signal. Someone beneath the house was trying to communicate. Carta did not sleep again that night. Instead he sat beside the candle, staring at the floor until morning light finally crept through the windows. At sunrise he saddled his horse without speaking to the Mercer family. Before leaving, he wrote a short entry in his leather journal. The words would later become part of the official investigation. There is something alive beneath that house. 3 days later Samuel Carta would return to the parish sheriff. And what authorities would discover beneath the Mercer home would shock the entire state of Louisiana. Because the knocking beneath the Mercer floorboards had been coming from children. Children who had not seen sunlight in years. The trapdoor beneath the house. 3 days after Samuel Carta rode away from the Mercer farm, the parish sheriff finally agreed to listen to him. Sheriff Elias Ward had spent nearly 20 years working law in northern Louisiana. Most of his cases were simple: stolen livestock, drunken fights, occasional land disputes between farmers. Nothing about Samuel Carter's story sounded like a crime, at least not at first. But the preacher was persistent. And there was something about the way he described the knocking beneath the Mercer house that made Ward uneasy. Animals did not knock in patterns. Animals did not whisper for help. Finally, Ward agreed to ride out to the Mercer property with 2 deputies. The journey took most of the afternoon. By the time they reached the farm, the sun was already beginning to dip low behind the trees. Jonathan Mercer stood waiting on the porch when the sheriff arrived. He looked calm, almost prepared. Ward introduced himself politely, and explained why he had come. Mercer listened quietly. Then he laughed, a short, controlled laugh. You rode all the way out here because a preacher heard animals under my house. The sheriff remained patient. He had seen stubborn men before. We just want to take a look beneath the house, Ward said. Mercer's expression changed slightly. Only for a moment, but the sheriff noticed it, a flicker of something behind the man's eyes, not anger, not surprise, something closer to calculation. There's nothing down there, Mercer replied. Just dirt and wood beams, Ward nodded. Then you won't mind if we check. For several seconds the 2 men stared at each other in silence. Then Mercer stepped aside. Go ahead. The deputies moved toward the side of the house where the foundation stood several feet above the ground. Old farmhouses like this were often raised on wooden supports, leaving a crawlspace beneath the structure. One deputy lit a lantern. The other lay flat on the ground and began sliding beneath the house. The lantern light flickered against the dirt and beams. Cobwebs clung to the underside of the floorboards. The crawlspace smelled of damp soil and wood rot. The deputy moved slowly forward, scanning the ground with the lantern. At first everything appeared normal. Support posts, loose stones, animal tracks. But after a few moments something unusual came into view. The dirt beneath the center of the house looked different. It was darker, recently disturbed, as if someone had been digging. The deputy crawled closer. Then the lantern light revealed something that made him stop immediately. There was a wooden panel built directly into the floor above, perfectly square, about 3 feet across. It was not part of the original construction. The wood was newer. The edges carefully fitted between the floorboards, a trapdoor. The deputy backed out from beneath the house quickly. "There's a door down there," he said. Sheriff Ward turned slowly toward Jonathan Mercer. The farmer's face had gone pale. "Open it," Ward ordered. The deputies returned beneath the house with a crowbar. The wooden panel had been secured tightly from above. But after several minutes of prying and hammering, the latch finally broke. The trapdoor creaked open. A narrow ladder disappeared into darkness below. A cold draft of air rose from the opening. Ward took the lantern. "I'll go down first." The ladder groaned softly under his weight as he descended. The air inside the chamber was thick, stale, heavy with the smell of damp earth. When Ward reached the bottom, he raised the lantern slowly. The room was small, barely large enough for several people to sit. The walls were rough wooden planks reinforced with dirt. A few blankets lay in one corner, a bucket, a metal bowl, and then Ward saw them. 3 figures huddled together against the wall, children. Their faces were pale in the lantern light, their eyes wide with fear. For several seconds no one spoke. The children shielded their faces from the lantern as if the light hurt them. The sheriff's voice came out quietly. "It's all right," he said. "We're here to help you." The oldest child slowly lowered his hands. The sheriff recognized him immediately. Daniel Mercer, the boy the town had occasionally seen working in the fields. But the other 2 children looked very different. The younger boy and the girl were thin, their skin almost colorless. Their eyes blinked rapidly in the lantern light as if they had not seen daylight in a very long time. "How long have you been down here?" Ward asked gently. Daniel hesitated. Then he answered with a voice that sounded far too quiet for a child. "Father says the world above is dangerous." The sheriff felt a chill run through him. Behind him the deputies descended the ladder and froze when they saw the chamber. None of them had expected this. Ward climbed back up through the trapdoor slowly. Jonathan Mercer was still standing in the yard, waiting. Ward looked at him carefully. "Your children were locked under this house." Mercer did not deny it. He did not shout. He did not run. Instead he spoke calmly. "I was protecting them." The sheriff stared at him. From what? Mercer looked. Toward the dark tree line beyond the fields, from the world. Within hours the Mercer farm was surrounded by authorities and neighbors. Word spread quickly through the parish. 3 children had been living beneath the house, hidden underground, for years. But the deeper investigators looked into the Mercer family, the more disturbing the story became. Because Jonathan Mercer had not built that underground chamber recently. According to the wood and construction, it had existed for nearly 4 years. And the knocking Samuel Carter had heard beneath the floor had not been an animal trying to escape. It had been the children. Trying to be heard. The children who forgot the sun. When the trapdoor beneath the Mercer house was opened, the town believed the worst part of the story had already been discovered. They were wrong. Because what investigators learned about the children in the following days would disturb the entire parish in ways no one expected. The 3 Mercer children were taken from the underground chamber just before sunset. At first, the deputies expected them to run outside. Children locked underground for years should have rushed toward open air, toward freedom, toward sunlight. But something strange happened instead. When the trapdoor opened and the children climbed the ladder, they hesitated. The lantern light from the deputies made them squint painfully. Their eyes blinked rapidly, watering as if the light itself hurt them. Then one of the deputies gently guided them toward the yard. The moment the first ray of late afternoon sunlight touched the children's faces, they froze. The girl, Sarah Mercer, covered her eyes immediately. She turned away from the sun, pressing her face against her brother's shoulder. The younger boy, Thomas, did the same. Daniel, the oldest, simply stood still. His eyes narrowed into thin slits as he tried to look at the sky. But he could not hold his gaze there for more than a few seconds. It was the first time investigators realized something terrible. The children had not simply been kept underground. They had been kept there long enough to forget what sunlight felt like. Doctors from the nearest town were summoned the next morning. The children were brought to a nearby farmhouse where neighbors attempted to care for them. But the situation quickly revealed how unusual their lives had been. The children did not behave like other children. They moved quietly, slowly, almost cautiously, as if every sound around them was unfamiliar. When someone opened a window to let fresh air into the room, Thomas immediately backed away from it. The wind frightened him. When a horse passed outside pulling a wagon, Sarah covered her ears. The sound of wheels on gravel made her panic. And the strangest detail of all, the children did not know the names of several common things. When the doctor pointed to the sun through the window and asked Sarah what it was, she hesitated. Then she answered in a whisper, "The bright thing." She did not know the word for sun. The doctors began documenting everything. Their notes painted a disturbing picture. The children's skin was pale, extremely pale. Years without sunlight had left it almost colorless. Their muscles were weak, their bodies thin from limited food and movement, but their behavior revealed something even more troubling. They had adapted to life underground. Their eyes had become sensitive to light. Their hearing was unusually sharp. They reacted to small sounds that adults could barely hear. And they had developed a strange method of communication. The knocking 3 taps pores. 3 taps. The children explained that they used the pattern to speak to each other through the wooden floor when they were separated. When investigators asked how long they had lived beneath the house, the answers were unclear. Daniel believed it had been several years. But the younger two could not remember a time when they had lived anywhere else. To them, the underground room was simply home. The deputies returned to the Mercer property to examine the chamber more carefully. What they discovered made the situation even more disturbing. The room had not been built in a hurry. It had been constructed deliberately. Carefully reinforced wooden beams supported the walls. Shelves had been built into the dirt. A small ventilation pipe ran upward through the floorboards. The chamber was not meant for temporary use. It had been designed to keep people alive there for a very long time. But the most unsettling discovery was found near the ladder. Scratched into the wooden wall were dozens of marks, small lines carved with a sharp object. Some grouped together, some crossed out. Sheriff Ward studied them for a long time before realizing what they were. The children had been counting days. But the marks stretched across nearly 4 years. 4 years beneath the house. 4 years without sunlight. 4 years living in a space no larger than a storage cellar. When the investigators confronted Jonathan Mercer with the evidence, his explanation shocked them even further. Mercer did not appear ashamed. He did not appear angry. Instead, he spoke with calm certainty. "The world above is dangerous," he repeated. Ward crossed his arms. "Dangerous how?" Mercer looked toward the distant tree line again, his voice lowered slightly. "You don't see what happens out there." The sheriff waited. But Mercer did not continue. Instead, he added something that unsettled the investigators even more. "I kept them safe." That statement made little sense to the authorities, because the Mercer farm had never been threatened. There were no bandits in the area, no violent raids, no disasters that required hiding children underground. The explanation simply did not fit reality. But Mercer believed it completely. In the days that followed, doctors and investigators slowly began piecing together the children's lives. Every evening Jonathan Mercer would open the trapdoor. He would lower food, water, sometimes books, sometimes tools, but the children were rarely allowed to leave. Sometimes Daniel was brought up to work in the fields, but the younger two almost never saw the surface. And whenever the children asked why they had to remain below, Mercer always gave them the same answer. "Because the world above will destroy you." The investigators could not determine whether Mercer truly believed this, or whether something else had driven him to isolate his children. But the psychological damage was undeniable. The children had grown up in darkness, and the sunlight they were now forced to face felt like something foreign, almost hostile. But the story was about to become even darker, because when authorities searched the Mercer house itself, they discovered something that suggested the underground chamber was only part of a much larger plan. And the next discovery would raise a terrifying question. Had Jonathan Mercer been preparing to keep the children underground forever? The father's plan beneath the house. By the end of the first week after the discovery beneath the Mercer house, the quiet farming parish had transformed into something very different. The story had spread beyond the county. Reporters arrived from nearby towns. Doctors examined the children, and investigators began searching every corner of the Mercer property. At first, the authorities believed the underground chamber had been Mercer's entire secret. But the more they examined the farmhouse, the more unsettling the situation became. Because beneath the calm exterior of the Mercer home, someone had been preparing for something far larger. The first disturbing discovery came from inside the barn. One of the deputies had been searching the storage room when he noticed several wooden crates stacked against the far wall. At first glance, they appeared to contain normal farm supplies. But when the crates were opened, the deputies found something strange. Inside were dozens of sealed jars, each jar filled with dried food, beans, cornmeal, preserved vegetables, enough supplies to feed several people for years. Sheriff Ward stood silently beside the crates. Farmers often stored food for winter, but this was different. This was not seasonal storage, this was long-term survival preparation, and that raised a troubling question. Why would a farmer in rural Louisiana prepare supplies as if he expected the outside world to disappear? The deputies continued searching. Inside a small wooden cabinet near the back of the barn, they discovered another strange detail. Dozens of handwritten notebooks. The notebooks were carefully organized, each filled with notes written in Mercer's precise handwriting. At first the entries appeared harmless. Observations about the weather, crop yields, river levels. But as the sheriff continued reading, the tone of the notebooks slowly changed. The later entries became darker, more paranoid. One page read, "The signs are increasing." Another entry written months later said, "The sky will turn against us soon." Ward frowned. There were no storms reported during that time, no disasters, no war, yet Mercer seemed convinced that something terrible was approaching. As the sheriff flipped further through the notebooks, one final entry caught his attention. It had been written only weeks before the discovery. "The children must remain below until the world above becomes safe again." Ward closed the notebook slowly. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances, because that single sentence suggested something deeply disturbing. Jonathan Mercer had never planned to release the children. The underground chamber was not temporary, it was permanent. And the supplies in the barn suggested Mercer had been preparing to keep them there for many more years, perhaps even decades. But the investigation was far from finished. The most unsettling discovery came later that afternoon. One of the deputies searching the farmhouse found a loose floorboard in Mercer's bedroom. Hidden beneath it was a small wooden box. Inside the box were several folded maps, old survey maps of the surrounding region. At first they seemed ordinary, but when Ward examined them more closely, he noticed strange markings drawn across the pages. Mercer had circled several locations across the countryside, farms, roads, even the nearby town. And beside each location Mercer had written short notes: unsafe, too exposed, crowded. Ward stared at the maps for several seconds, then he noticed something else. Every circle drawn on the maps was connected by a series of lines. The lines all pointed toward one place, the Mercer farm. It was as if Mercer believed his property was the only safe location in the entire region. But what truly disturbed the investigators was the final map. Drawn in Mercer's own hand, it showed the Mercer house, and beneath it a carefully drawn diagram of the underground chamber. But the chamber on the map was far larger than the one investigators had discovered. Additional rooms were sketched beside it, storage areas, ventilation shafts, even a second hidden exit leading toward the woods. Ward felt a chill run through him. Mercer had been planning to expand the underground structure. The chamber beneath the house had only been the beginning. That night the sheriff returned to the jail where Jonathan Mercer was being held. Mercer sat calmly on the wooden bench inside the cell. Ward placed the map on the table. "You were building more rooms underground." Mercer looked at the drawing. Then he nodded slowly. "Yes." The sheriff leaned forward. "For what?" Mercer's answer came quietly. "For when it begins." Ward frowned. "What begins?" For the first time since the arrest, Mercer's expression changed. His eyes drifted toward the small bad window of the jail, toward the darkening sky outside. "The world above is changing," he said. "You just haven't seen it yet." The sheriff waited for Mercer to explain further, but Mercer simply folded his hands and remained silent. The investigators would later try to understand Mercer's motives. Some believed he had suffered from a severe psychological illness. Others believed his isolation and paranoia had slowly twisted his thinking. But the most disturbing possibility was something else entirely. What if Mercer truly believed he was protecting his children? What if, in his mind, the underground chamber was not a prison but a shelter? And what if the children had been locked away not because Mercer hated the world but because he feared it? But even that explanation would soon become more complicated. Because as doctors continued questioning the Mercer children, Daniel Mercer would eventually reveal something investigators had not expected. Something that suggested the underground chamber had not only been Mercer's idea, and that discovery would raise a terrifying possibility. Had someone else been helping him build it? The secret Daniel finally told. For several days after the children were rescued from beneath the Mercer house, The authorities focused almost entirely on Jonathan Mercer. Doctors examined him. Investigators questioned him. Reporters tried to understand why a father would lock his own children underground for years. But Mercer refused to give any real explanation. He repeated the same words again and again. I was protecting them. The sheriff eventually realized something important. Jonathan Mercer might never explain the truth, but someone else might. The oldest child, Daniel Mercer. Daniel was nearly 14 years old. Unlike his younger brother and sister, he had occasionally been allowed above ground. He had worked beside his father in the fields. He had seen the outside world. And more importantly, he had been old enough to remember when the underground chamber was first built. The sheriff visited the farmhouse where the children were staying. Daniel sat quietly at the kitchen table, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. The afternoon sunlight from the window made him squint slightly. He still wasn't used to the brightness. Ward sat down across from him. I need to ask you some questions, the sheriff said gently. Daniel nodded. Ward paused for a moment. Then he asked the question investigators had been waiting to ask. Why did your father keep you beneath the house? Daniel didn't answer immediately. His eyes drifted toward the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. Because of the nights. The sheriff leaned forward. What nights? Daniel hesitated. Then he looked up slowly. The nights when the forest talks. Ward felt a slight chill run through him. What do you mean? Daniel glanced toward the window, toward the distant tree line. When the sun goes down, the forest changes. Ward waited. Daniel continued speaking quietly. At first we only heard it sometimes. Father heard it before we did. Hearing what? Daniel swallowed. The voices. The sheriff's expression remained steady, but his mind raced. Voices in the forest. Was this another sign of Mercer's paranoia, or something the children had been taught to believe? Daniel continued. They came from the woods at night. Soft voices, calling from far away. Ward frowned slightly. Calling who? Daniel's answer came almost immediately. Us. The sheriff sat back in his chair. Your father believed the voices were dangerous. Daniel nodded slowly. He said the forest was trying to take us. The room fell silent for several seconds. Then Ward asked another question. When did he first start building the chamber? Daniel looked down at his hands. I was 10. He told us the world was changing. He said something was waking up in the forest. The sheriff rubbed his forehead slowly. He had heard strange stories before. Rural communities often created legends about nearby woods. But this was different. Because Mercer had acted on the fear, he had built an underground shelter, and locked his children inside it. Ward asked carefully. Did you ever hear these voices yourself? Daniel nodded. Yes. The sheriff waited. Daniel's voice became even quieter. Sometimes they sounded like children. A cold silence filled the room. Children, Ward repeated. Daniel nodded again. They called our names. The sheriff felt a wave of unease move through him. Because the Mercer property was surrounded by miles of empty forest. There were no nearby houses. No villages hidden in the woods. No reason for voices to be calling children at night. Ward forced himself to remain calm. What did your father do when you heard them? Daniel answered immediately. He moved us underground. The boy's eyes drifted toward the window again. He said the voices couldn't reach us below the ground. For several moments neither of them spoke. Finally Ward asked the question that had been troubling him since the beginning. Did the voices ever stop? Daniel's expression changed slightly. For the first time fear appeared in his eyes. No, he said quietly. They only got closer. The sheriff stared at him. What do you mean? Daniel leaned forward slightly. The last night before you came they were right outside the house. Ward's heart began beating faster. What happened then? Daniel looked toward the floor again. Father locked the trapdoor. He said we had to stay quiet, and then the knocking started. The sheriff frowned. The knocking. Daniel nodded slowly. That wasn't us. The room fell silent. Ward's voice dropped to almost a whisper. If it wasn't you, then who was knocking? Daniel raised his eyes slowly. And what he said next would haunt the investigation for years. It was something trying to get in. For weeks after that conversation, investigators searched the Mercer property again and again. They examined the forest, they questioned neighbors. But they found no evidence of voices, no tracks. No signs that anyone had been approaching the house at night. Most authorities eventually concluded that Mercer had suffered from severe paranoia, and that the children had simply adopted his fears after years of isolation. But the sheriff never fully accepted that explanation. Because on the night before Jonathan Mercer was transferred to the state prison, a guard reported hearing something strange outside the jail. 3 slow knocks, pause, 3 more knocks, coming from somewhere beyond the walls. The silence beneath the house. In the weeks following Jonathan Mercer's arrest, the small Louisiana parish slowly returned to its quiet routines. The reporters left. The investigators filed their reports, and the Mercer farm, once the center of the county's attention, became something people avoided discussing. But the house itself did not disappear. It still stood exactly where it always had. White paint peeling beneath the Louisiana sun. Tall oak trees casting shadows across the yard. And beneath the house the trapdoor remained. Sheriff Elias Ward visited the property several times after the investigation ended. At first it was simply part of procedure. Evidence needed to be documented. The underground chamber needed to be sealed. But each time he stepped onto the Mercer property, Ward felt the same uneasy sensation. The place felt wrong, not dangerous, not haunted, just wrong, as if something about the land itself had shifted. The trapdoor beneath the house had been nailed shut, the ladder removed, the chamber left empty. But even weeks later, the dirt floor still showed the faint marks scratched into the wall. The children's calendar. 4 years of lines carved into wood, 4 years measured in darkness. Ward stood there one afternoon holding a lantern, staring at those marks. He wondered what it must have felt like for the children. To wake every day in the same dim room. To wait for the trapdoor to open. To hear footsteps above their heads. And to believe the world outside was too dangerous to survive. The doctors later wrote detailed reports about the children's recovery. Daniel Mercer slowly began adapting to normal life. He spent long hours outdoors, learning again how to live in sunlight. The younger 2 children took longer. Thomas remained nervous around open spaces. Sarah struggled with sudden noises, but over time both of them began to adjust. The human mind, the doctors noted, has a remarkable ability to adapt even after years of darkness. Jonathan Mercer's trial took place in the spring of the following year. The courtroom was crowded. People wanted answers. Why had Mercer locked his children underground? What had driven him to build the hidden chamber? Prosecutors described him as mentally unstable, a man consumed by paranoia and irrational fears. Mercer's lawyer argued something very different. He claimed Mercer believed he was protecting his children, that the underground room had been intended as a shelter, a place of safety, not punishment. But the most chilling moment of the trial came when Mercer himself spoke. The courtroom fell silent as he stood before the judge. His voice was calm, almost patient. "I did what any father would do," he said. The judge asked the obvious question, "From what?" Mercer paused. Then he answered with the same certainty he had shown since the day of his arrest. "From what was coming out of the woods," courtroom murmured. But Mercer did not elaborate, and no one could prove the existence of anything he described. In the end, the court ruled Mercer guilty of unlawful imprisonment. He was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in the state penitentiary. The case officially closed. But Sheriff Ward could never completely forget the conversation he had with Daniel Mercer. The boy's quiet explanation of the voices, the knocking, and the final sentence Daniel had spoken, "That wasn't us." For months afterward, Ward occasionally rode past the Mercer property. Not because he had to, but because something about the place still troubled him. The farmhouse was empty now. No one wanted to live there. Farmers from nearby towns avoided the land entirely. Eventually the structure began to deteriorate. The porch boards rotted. The roof sagged, and vines slowly crept up the wooden walls. Nature was reclaiming the house, but the underground chamber remained untouched. Until, one night late in the summer of 1884, Ward had been returning from another town when his horse grew restless as he passed the old Mercer road. The sheriff slowed. The moon hung low above the trees, and the Mercer farmhouse stood in shadow at the end of the field. Ward considered continuing down the road, but something made him stop. A sound, soft, barely audible across the quiet countryside. He dismounted slowly, listened carefully. At first there was nothing, just the distant rustling of leaves. Then the sound came again, 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. Ward felt a chill move through his chest. The knocking was unmistakable, and it was coming from the Mercer property. He walked slowly toward the house. The boards creaked under his boots as he stepped onto the porch. The trapdoor beneath the house had been nailed shut months earlier. No one had entered since the investigation ended. Ward stood there for a long moment, listening. The night air was completely still. No wind moved through the trees, no animals stirred in the grass. And yet he could not shake the feeling that something beneath the house had answered him. Ward eventually returned to his horse. He rode away without reopening the trapdoor. Some mysteries, he later wrote in his journal, were better left buried. But years later, when the Mercer farmhouse finally collapsed into ruin, workers clearing the land would make one final discovery. The trapdoor beneath the house had been broken open. From the inside, sometimes the darkest mysteries are not the ones we cannot explain. They are the ones that leave us with too many explanations. Was Jonathan Mercer a paranoid father who locked his children underground because he feared the world? Or was he a man who believed something else was waiting for them outside? The investigation closed, the trial ended, and history eventually moved on. But the Mercer children's story left behind a question that no one in that Louisiana parish could ever answer. If the knocking beneath the house was not the children, then who or what was trying to reach them? And perhaps the most disturbing possibility of all, what if Jonathan Mercer wasn't trying to keep his children imprisoned? What if he was trying to keep something else from reaching them? This was just one file, one story buried in the forgotten corners of American history. But there are many others, hidden records, unsolved disappearances, strange patterns that no one has fully explained. And in the next file we will open another mystery, one where the evidence was not hidden beneath a house, but carved into the walls of a school where 5 children were marked present on a day the building was closed. If you're ready to open that record, I'll see you in the next file.